All right, Aubrey. Hey, how's it going today? How are
I'm
you?
great. Hi, Lindsay. How are you?
Good. Glad to be on the mic. Would you consider yourself a creative person?
Oh, I'm actually not a very creative
Oh, come
person.
on.
I've
I
always
don't
been
believe that. I
I
actually
don't
don't
know.
believe that.
In comparison to like Jessica, she creates blown glass. She's very artistic. And it's always been shocking. My dad is an artist. You can see his paintings surrounding me here and my brother, but I am creative when it comes to writing. Like I've written a few books, but
That's
visual art,
creative.
not so much
Yeah. But
in
it's a
my own
very
way.
narrow definition of creativity, right? I think creativity can be a lot of things. It can be a way of thinking, right? Your thought patterns, your writing, your physical art. It could be even in movement. A dancer is creative, wouldn't you say?
I'm
Creating new
also not a
dances.
dancer.
Yeah.
No, it's true though. Everyone's creative in their own
Yeah,
way, right? What about you,
totally.
Lindsay? How do you express your creativity?
Um, so, I also would probably say I'm not creative, but if I think about it more, I think I'm creative in the way I think about my meditation and spiritual practice
Mm,
actually, and like thinking about life on different levels and different kind of realms of reflection.
okay.
I would call that creative, just not your traditional
That is
creative
creative, though,
creativity.
right? I'm
Yeah.
creative in the way I view the world and my spirituality.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Well,
for
this
sure.
came up recently. It's very interesting because, first of all, you can't be creative when it comes to suffixes. Unfortunately, this is part two of
Yeah.
a two-part series because suffixes in English can often throw us off.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We can't just assume that the suffix is always going to look the same. And this was based on a mistake that we heard, right, Aubrey?
Exactly. Yes, I heard a student make the mistake. They said, "This helps me express my creativeness." So they're
Yeah.
thinking that they can take the adjective creative
Yeah.
and add ness to make a noun, which often that is the case, right? That's usually the
Yes.
pattern. But sometimes instead of ness, we add ity. So in this case, you would say, "This helps me express my creativity."
Right. And by the way, don't forget, guys, the only way we get better is by actually making those mistakes, right, Aubrey? No one gets better
Absolutely.
by sitting back and listening to other people make mistakes. So we're praising this student that we interacted with for making that mistake because that is the path to connection in English, is making
Absolutely, right?
mistakes.
This student was practicing speaking English. You're going to make mistakes, not a big deal. But
Mhm.
as you recognize them and improve, that is how we improve grammar. And
Yes.
as you just, have conversations without stressing about it, that's how we improve fluency.
Love it. So good. So good. All right. Do we have another episode to send our listeners back to?
Yeah, guys, don't miss part one. Scroll up 2246, silly suffixes part one. Don't let ION throw you off. And
Yeah.
today we're talking about the suffix ness, Ness.
Yes. And so let's get into this suffix. I mean, what do we need to know about it? What does it do to a word?
Yeah. So often we do add ness to adjectives to create a noun, but the problem is it's not always, right? A lot of
Uh-huh.
adjectives break this, or a lot of nouns break this rule. So, for example, we can't add ness to creative. Instead, we add the ity like we're sharing. And today we'll
Mhm.
share some other vocabulary to watch out for, some common mistakes we see with these nouns.
Yes. Okay, cool. So the let's give some examples of when it can be added, right?
Yes.
So for example, the word alert, Aubrey. What would
Yeah.
make it a noun? So
Yeah,
I'm
we add
alert.
ness, right? Alertness.
Yes.
So you might say, "I didn't sleep well last night," which explains my lack of mental alertness.
Mhm.
Hopefully, that's not the case for any of you out there. Sometimes I do have insomnia, but ever since I got to Idaho, I've
Do
been
you have
sleeping like a
insomnia?
baby.
Okay. Oh,
Thank
geez.
goodness.
Wow. Good.
Maybe
Yeah.
it's because it's
Sometimes
colder. It's
the
always
cooler
cold at
weather.
night here.
100%. It is so like sleep temperature really matters when it comes to
So true.
not being awake all night.
Right.
Here's another sentence. Travelers to this area should practice extra alertness and take
Oh,
precautions or
yeah, and
something, I would say.
take
Right?
precaution,
Mhm.
So if we
Yes.
think about this suffix ness, right, it means
Mhm.
state, condition, quality, so it's used with an adjective to say something about the state or condition of
Mhm.
being that adjective, right? So, for example, redness means the quality of being red. So, often this is the case, a lot of adjectives follow this pattern. First thing we wanna have, just point out, watch out for spelling mistakes because words
Yes.
that end with Y, like happy, when we add ness, the Y becomes an I. So happiness is spelled INESS. That happens
Yes.
with a lot every time it ends with a Y.
Yes, I love that. The interesting thing about ness is that the thing that makes this extra tricky is that I think we often add this, we invent new words by
Yes.
adding ness, the nature of being some way. Um,
Exactly. So that's what we're talking
eh,
about today. So for example, right, because you can't always add ness. Could you
yes.
think of it? One that I thought of, I hear people sometimes say absurdness instead of absurdity.
Yes.
To say that something's
Yes.
absurd, you might say, I'm baffled by the absurdness of these rules. I know I've heard this. Native
Ugh,
speakers make this mistake as well, but you should add the ity. I'm baffled by the absurdity of these rules.
yes. Or even just, I think you can say this, the quality of being, let's say, from the US, being American, or other people are
Mm,
also American from South America, of course, Americanness. I believe we can even say that. So that's what I mean is of inventing, kind of sort
yes.
of creating your own word
That's a good
as a
point,
noun.
Lindsay. It's
Yeah.
sort of a
Mhm.
slang thing we do where we add ness to create, this adjective, often a noun, my Americanness, but that's very
Yes.
slang, right? It's very
Very
informal.
slang. Mhm.
And it's tricky because when we are writing or speaking more formally, we can't
Yeah.
be
Yes.
creative like that. We can't just
Yes.
add ness all the time and expect it to make sense.
Totally. So it's kind of two different things we're talking about here. We're getting pretty high level and pretty nuanced here, which we love to
Totally.
do in All Ears English. But it's very different from when you say something like cleanliness, mindfulness, forgetfulness. These are all standard. You can say these you can write them. But when you start
Exactly.
saying things like Americanness, uh, or any nationality or any nature of your personality, it starts to be slangy, and I would avoid writing that. Right?
Yes, exactly. Good point. Let's share one other example. I've also heard this mistake, acceptableness, right? So you might say,
Oh
like,
yeah, that
the
one doesn't
social
sound right.
acceptableness of these actions when it should be
Yeah.
acceptability, right? Social
Right.
acceptability of many actions has changed over the years.
Yeah, and it's hard when we've just finished telling our listeners people invent these and in a slangy way, and why couldn't you invent that and make that work? Acceptableness, but no, acceptability. There's a gut feeling too that we have to get, which means it comes from just exposure to the language, right?
Absolutely,
Listening.
right? The more you're taking in English, some of these will just sound right or wrong to you. So, yes, sometimes we can be creative with slang and informal speech, but when
Hmm.
maybe you're at work, maybe you're speaking a little more formally. And often, even with informal speech, a lot of these words we can't just add ness because there's no slang involved, right? When you're saying
Right.
acceptability, there's no slang here. You just, you can't say acceptableness because you're using slang. That's just incorrect grammar.
Yeah, for sure. So some things we just have to learn.
Yep.
Nice. All right. So moving into the why, do we want to say anything else about the why, Aubrey?
Yeah,
We
I'm
touched on it a
going to
little
give
bit.
a couple
Mhm.
of very brief things here. It's all about word origin, right? So we have all these
Ah.
Latin suffixes in English, and they
Hmm.
tend to go on Latin and Greek roots. And then
Okay.
native suffixes like less, ness, hood are what's called permissive and can also attach to these. So that's why it seems like there are exceptions.
Hmm.
It's all about where the root comes from. There are bound roots and Latin roots, and it gets really
Ah.
complicated. If you guys
Wow.
want to do a deep dive into grammar about suffixes and prefixes and roots, there's a lot there, but it just sort
Yes.
of helps you to know that like most of this is following rules based on
Yeah.
where the root is from.
Yeah. So if you love etymology, if you love linguistics, if you want to do that deep dive, you can do it and you can find a
Absolutely.
reason. But most people, and myself included, I'll speak for myself.
Me too.
I want to connect. I just want to connect with people. Right. And so I will try to listen to as much of the language as I can. Spanish, for
Absolutely.
example, when I'm learning a language, just listen as much as I can and listen to what I hear. Do I hear it in multiple places from multiple people? That's probably safe to use that. Right.
Yes, exactly. And we know you guys want to avoid mistakes, but even more importantly, we know you're wanting to connect in English. So this is hopefully
Yes.
giving you sort of an alertness about this issue, these common mistakes. But like you said, Lindsay, taking in English is the best way you're going to start recognizing and hearing these correctly so that you can then use them correctly.
Love it. Well, let's dive into a role play. I'm excited for our listeners
Yes.
to see these really come to life. So, today in this role play, we are discussing a controversial issue, which we've been getting into those controversial issues in the last few weeks, right? A hot summer. um,
Exactly.
Aubrey, you want to get us started here?
Yes, and to keep in mind, when I first wrote this role play, it was more of like a casual conversation. And then I
Okay.
realized all of these words are quite formal. And so I sort of changed it to a discussion about a controversial issue that would be you would start using words like this that don't come up as often in casual conversation. So
Love
I'll
it.
start us
This is
out
gonna
here.
push our level higher then in that case. Yes.
Exactly. All right.
Good.
I'm glad you brought this up. I'm kind of embarrassed by my lack of alertness that it was even an issue.
Oh, no worries. I only just heard about it on the news.
I'm often appalled by the absurdity of things I hear on the news. It's tempting just to avoid it.
I kind of think the lack of social acceptability is surprising. What do you think?
I agree.
Okay. Yeah, high
Yes.
level, right?
Very
Mhm.
high level, and you can see how, like, as I'm trying to fit, alertness and absurdity and acceptability into a conversation, we don't use these words as commonly when we're just
Yes.
chatting over coffee about our day, but they do come up as we're getting deeper about topics, talking about something we heard on a podcast or in the news. Then we do use these words.
And sometimes you just want to elevate your speech a little bit. This is a good example of it. Maybe before this, we've got to been maybe gossiping or something. You're talking about everyday things like the weather. You're more casual, and then you're getting into a current event or something important. You're gonna sit up a bit more straight and use bigger words and more formal words. So that's kind of what we're
Exactly.
doing here, right?
Yeah, so let's go
Yes.
through this. I first said, kind of embarrassed by my lack of alertness that this was even an issue. So this has happened
Yes.
to me where someone will bring up something they heard on the news or something in a podcast, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I had not even heard about this. I'm so glad you're sharing with
Right.
me because sometimes it's a little embarrassing because I don't watch the news that often. Like
Yeah.
this is very appropriate for me. This role play where I'm like, sometimes I'm tempted just to avoid it, so I don't have to think about all
Yeah.
of these
You
frustrating issues.
It's hard. I'm also trying to read the news less before bed, but if
Mm.
you listen to the news ever, this would be the week to do it because this is the week that all the big Supreme Court decisions come out. It's always the last week in June. So just a side point, big week on the political scene and in the Supreme Court, the US
Yes.
Supreme Court. So
For you
lots going
guys, it
on.
was a few weeks ago. For us, we're recording at the end of
That's
June.
true.
So yes, it's a big week in the news for
That's
us
true.
right now.
Very good point. Good point. All
Yeah.
right. So then you said, I'm often appalled by the absurdity of things I hear on the news. It's tempting just to avoid it. Yes.
Yeah, so that's where you would use this noun absurdity, the absurdity of something, meaning you think it's absurd, you think it's unreasonable or crazy.
And then what did I say, Aubrey?
You said, I kind of think the lack of social acceptability is surprising. So you can see I didn't really share what the controversial topic is that we
Right.
were just, but clearly it has something to do with a lack of social acceptability, which this is often how I hear this noun used. It's often collocated with the social acceptability of something.
Interesting. I like it. Guys, add these to your repertoire. These are very high level words here that you can pull out when it comes to just a slightly elevated conversation, right?
Yes. And as a takeaway, you guys, using the correct suffix will up your game. These
Love that.
mistakes happen a ton. And keep in mind, native speakers make these mistakes as well as language learners. So don't stress about it. Very common mistakes, both in part one, that ION suffix, and also the ness, NESS. But the more you're immersing yourself in English, the more some of them will just sound right.
Awesome. And I love that expression as a takeaway. Up your game, by the way. That's a fantastic word. Improve. It'll make you better. So, guys, hit that follow button to get the next episode of All Ears English. And Aubrey, thanks for bringing this topic today. Good
Yeah.
stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. See you next time.
All right. Talk to you very soon. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.